evening, everyone, and thank you for joining California Lawyers for the Arts for Intersections, Art and Law at the Border, our second annual symposium. My name is Diana Cervera, and I'm the Program Manager for California Lawyers for the Arts here in San Diego. I'm joined today by our Special Projects Coordinator, Sara Gonzalez, who co-led this project and helped make tonight's event possible. Also on the call are members of our statewide staff, including Alma Robinson, our Executive Director, and Gloria Ruiz Oster, our newly appointed Southern California Director. Before we begin tonight's program, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we are on is native land. The border region of San Diego-Tijuana is the ancestral territory and homeland of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present. We recognize that we are guests in the Kumeyaay's homeland, and as guests, I extend my respect and gratitude to the many indigenous peoples who still reside here and call these lands their home. I would like to pass the mic to Sara Gonzalez, who will share with you a little bit more about California Lawyers for the Arts and the services we offer across the state.
Thank you, Diana, for that warm welcome. Today, I'll be talking about California Lawyers for the Arts. California Lawyers for the Arts is a statewide nonprofit that was founded in 1974, serving artists and arts organizations. We currently have offices in San Francisco, Berkeley, Sacramento, Los Angeles, and the brand new branch in San Diego. We offer 3 core services for the arts community. The first is our Lawyer Referral and Information Service, which is a State Bar of California certified. The LRIS matches creative artists with attorneys throughout all of California. We also administer the California Inventors Assistance Program to assist independent inventors and small startups with their patent legal issues. Our Arts Arbitration and Mediation Services, also known as the AAMS, provides low-cost community conflict resolution services which seek to resolve disputes for involved parties outside of court. Finally, we have what brings you here this evening, our education programming, where we offer a variety of workshops, symposia, and conferences on various legal topics for artists and arts organizations. Please visit our website, calawyersforthearts.org, for more information.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Gless. I'm the Executive Director of the Commission for Arts and Culture for the City of San Diego. I'd like to welcome you to this second annual Art and Law at the Border Symposium. On behalf of the Commission, I'd like to thank California Lawyers for the Arts for their partnership, their leadership, and for producing this important event. I'll be attending along with you and look forward to virtually meeting you in the coming days. Welcome to the conversation.
The US-Mexico border has been described as an open wound, an arbitrary divide delineating the meeting of nation states and defining that which is inside and that which is left out. Characterized by a constant tempering and transmutation, a border region is a delicate and complex ecosystem fraught with the push and pull of political attitudes, global debates on migration, and intricate networks of power. Artistic and legal adaptations manifest in this liminal space. Artists challenge us to investigate what exists between and beyond the walls, to reimagine our world as a place where many realities coexist. Legal advocates strive to impact the evolution of relationships at borders and improve the movement of people and ideas. California Lawyers for the Arts invites artists, activists, lawyers, scholars, and researchers to explore, complicate, and expand our understanding of the concept of border. We are very delighted to have you all here with us tonight for the 5th panel in our series, Property Rights, Native American Arts and Culture. Sara, if you would like to go ahead and introduce the panel, and I'll introduce the panelists.
Thank you. Individuals often mistake cultural artifacts as art, and the proprietary interests and culture of indigenous communities often find their way into online markets and auctions, when in fact these items were wrested involuntarily from the communities where they were created. In addition, with the art realm, there is an important distinction between American Indian art, which is protected by the federal American Indian Arts and Craft Act, and knockoff art created by importers or tourist shops. Museums have not always understood the value and cultural context of items in their collection. This panel will join in conversation Native American artists, scholars, and attorneys who work to ensure the appropriate use and identification of Native American art and work to protect and preserve Native American culture.
Thank you, Sara. So tonight we have Mr. Theodore J. Griswold, who is the leader of the Procopio, Corey Hargraves, and Savage LLP real estate and environmental team. TED has counseled clients on Native American governance, intergovernmental agreements, alternative energy, natural and cultural resources, wetlands, habitat, environmental, and land use matters. As the founder of the Native American Practice Group, much of TED's practice focuses on Native American governments and tribal land issues. He regularly assists tribal public agency and private clients in negotiating and receiving permit approvals from all permitting agencies, including tribal governments, Bureau of Indian Affairs, California Department of Transportation, and many more. Tonight, Mr. Griswold will also be serving as our moderator and framing our conversation. Also on tonight's panel is Shasta Gaugen, and she is the Environmental Director and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pala Band of Mission Indians in Pala, California. She has worked for Pala since January 2005 and established Pala's Tribal Historic Preservation Office in 2008. She's also been an adjunct professor in the anthropology department at California State University, San Marcos since 2006. Dr. Gaugen received her BA in anthropology and BS in natural resources at Humboldt State University in 1996. Her MA in anthropology from San Diego State University in 2001, and her PhD in anthropology from the University of New Mexico in 2011. She's the chair of the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, a member of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, Secretary of the Board for the Native American Environmental Protection Coalition, lead of the Tribal Working Group for the Climate Science Alliance South Coast, a member of the Institute of Tribal Environmental Professionals Climate Advisory Group, and Vice President of the Board for the Upper San Luis Rey Resource Conservation District. Also today, we have Johnny Bear Contreras, who is a public artist since 1996. He has exhibited nationally through his public commissions of bronze sculpture, bending and welding contemporary aluminum and stainless steel 3D pieces. In addition to his years of experience in art, Contreras has taught Native tradition to and mentored the youth of the local tribes and is currently a member of KCRC. Johnny's art has evolved into a current panel for Comic-Con called Rediscovering Indigenous History Through Comics. Through his art, Johnny strives to keep the world connected to the culture and traditions of the Native people. And finally, we have Ross Frank. Professor Ross Frank holds degrees in history from Yale College, Oxford University, and UC Berkeley, and teaches and writes about the history and the material culture of Native America. While completed graduate school at Berkeley, Frank spent time working for Apple. As a result, Professor Frank helped build the Tribal Digital Village, a broadband network created and directed by a consortium of 19 Southern Californian Indian nations to integrate digital technology resources and techniques into existing and desired cultural, educational, health, economic, and governance activities. He founded and directs the Plains Indian Ledger Art Digital Publishing Project. Dr. Frank is particularly interested in the resource that this art form provides to Native American communities to resituate their own portrayal of their past, present, and future. Thank you all for being here and welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Diana. I really appreciate the opportunity to give this talk. Thank you very much, California Lawyers for the Arts, for giving us this opportunity. And thank you so much for those interested in learning about this, what we think is a real important topic. It'll be about an hour and a half that we'll be talking, and we're going to make this largely conversational. And the idea is that we want to start a conversation with you about some really important issues that we think are not looked at and thought about often enough, and we can increase that understanding as we go through. A little bit about how this came about. Diana came to me a little over a year ago, and we were looking at doing a panel last year. She talked about border and art, and she knew that I did a lot of work in Native American communities. And the question was, you know, is there something you can do to fit with the program on art and the border and Native American work? And you know, it came to me, yes, of course. A lot of the controversies about Native American art are things that cross the border illegally. And also a lot of the issues arise, and I thought Diana did a great initial review at the beginning, of the fact that we have transnational or transborder nations that have been there for millennia. And they don't, you know, they were created, their resources are there, the people are there, the culture is there, and knows nothing about an artificial international border. And as a result, you know, the arts and the cultures actually span both sides. And we thought that was something that was really important for us to bring out to the general public. And we appreciate you coming here today to understand a little bit more about that. We'll be talking in kind of some broad topics tonight. We're not going to get into all the detail on all these subjects, because if we did that, we'd be in a 3-day symposium and you'd get really hungry by the end of it. So I understand that. But one of the things that we do need to do is, this is a Lawyers for the Arts Law Symposium. And so I'm going to start off laying some of the groundwork on some of the laws that are going to be surrounding some of the issues that we're going to be talking about, which is the intersection between culture, art, people that deal with culture and art appropriately, and in many cases misappropriately, and how those can be dealt with. But we really have to start at the very beginning with the ground. So we're going to start from the ground up. And where we're going to go is, we're going to first talk about the bevy of state and federal laws that protect from projects that are being impacted, cultural resources that are in the ground, that were left by people before us, and sometimes recent people that are down in the ground, that are actually part of the landscape. We have a number of laws that affect that way. California Environmental Quality Act has a requirement to protect and look at impacts to cultural resources and tribal cultural resources, even on a landscape scale. The National Historic Preservation Act requires tribal consultation in all steps of the process when a federal agency or an effort that is funded by the federal government may affect historic properties and Native American tribe or Native Hawaiian religious or cultural significant property. National Environmental Policy Act requires the Indian tribes to be invited into environmental review and cultural resources to be considered. And the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, that's called Nagpra, and you're going to be hearing a lot about that tonight. That provides for the protecting and planning for Native American remains from and other cultural items that may be removed from federal lands or tribal lands for a project that might have federal agency or some other entity, but federal funding, some kind of federal connection. And then finally, there's the Antiquities Act, 1906. That was when President Roosevelt signed into law kind of the first legislative acknowledgement that the things that are in the ground, the culture that's part of our earth, before we settled this country and took over this country as the United States of America, are really important resources to the United States of America. It was the first law ever to set up the importance of archaeological sites on public lands and important public resources. It was their first effort to protect these sites from vandalism, from haphazard digging, from commercial looting, artifact looting, which became a real problem in late 1800s and early 1900s. And it obligates the federal agencies that manage public agencies to adequately protect these resources. Unfortunately, it had a limited effect for a couple of reasons. One, it only applied on federal lands, and enforcement of it was very, very limited until just recently in the last few decades. So that's where we are with some of the land laws. But then, okay, so how does that deal with our art situation? Well, what it has to deal with is what happens when those items come out of the ground? What happens when those things are disturbed and they come up and are put into people's hands and into homes and into markets and into auctions and that sort of thing? Well, that's when it becomes a real problem. That's when the ownership of these cultural items that are supposed to be protected becomes a significant legal issue, a property issue, a cultural issue, and a rights issue. And that's most of what we're going to be talking about today, is when these items are dug up and used for ulterior purposes that are not intended to. And as Diana suggested at the beginning of this, one of the points that's really important to remember is that everywhere we walk today, where all of us are sitting virtually, if you're in the United States of America, where all of us are sitting, this is all current and former indigenous lands. People were here. A lot of what was here by those people that came before us is obscured by development and urbanization. Hard to see what they are, but they were here. And so cultural artifacts, cultural articles are everywhere. And we can't think that they're only going to be on an Indian reservation or something like that. We're running into that right now along the California border. where the Trump administration is building the wall and running into cultural articles and sacred sites, burial grounds, village sites, things like that. You just never know where they're going to be. So the way I like to put them is they're ubiquitous. They might be rare, but they're ubiquitous. They could be anywhere. Additionally, one of the things that we want to look at is the sanctity of some of these sites, you know, and why they might be kind of hard to find. Why might they be not well recorded? Well, one of the reasons why was back in the late 1800s, Secretary of Interior Henry Teller, he issued some rules. He was the Secretary of the Interior at the time, to the courts of Indian offenses. And he prohibited Native American ceremonial activity under a penalty of prison. Teller ordered Indian agents to discontinue dances, feasts, artwork, and to compel medicine men to give up their practices. And this was going on for a period of at least 50 years after this, where the culture was and sacred practices were driven underground. As late as the early 20th century, Native Christian groups were encouraging people to destroy indigenous relics, that they were non-Christian and they should be disappeared. And as a result, many of these things did start disappearing or were hidden or were certainly not well documented where they could be persecuted. And all this mostly came to end in 1978 with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which was supposed to protect this and recognize indigenous culture. So when you're looking at how we look to protect religious culture, indigenous religious culture now, it's really not been very long that we've been working towards this end. So it's a relatively new field. So what happens to the cultural resources? Well, you'll hear in this presentation, a lot of articles are collected, treated, sold as art, collectibles, antiquities. They're placed on people's shelves, on their mantles, next to their fireplace. They're sold at international auction houses. But who owns these? These items that were dug out of the ground. Sometimes they're skeletal remains. Sometimes they're things that were buried with people looking for their creator when the creator comes for them. Who owns these things? Probably not the individuals. And that's one of the proprietary issues that we want to talk about today. It's estimated by the auctioneer lobby, and they're the ones who estimate this, so I figure that this is probably a pretty low estimate, that there are currently hundreds of thousands of Native American objects in the stream of commerce for the auctioneers since the 1880s. And many of these change hands again and again and again. So tracking down the source of these and the ownership of these by a community is going to be very, very problematic. And where is the line between American Indian culture and art by an American Indian that's set out there by intention for sale and to tell a story, either their own personal story or maybe a cultural story? What is the line between culture and art? Well, that's one of the things we also want to talk about today, and we'll be hearing a few of those today. Now, when we get to that point, and we're starting to talk about the difference between culture and art, there are a few more statutes that actually do apply. I mentioned Nagpra, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. That was passed in 1990, and federal agencies and institutions that receive federal funds, and this includes universities, museums, state agencies, local agencies, anybody who receives federal funds or the federal government itself, they're required to begin the process of repatriating and transferring Native American human remains back to the cultures where they came from. They are to go through a process of consulting with the linear descendants of Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations on the remains and cultural items and put them into the pathway back to them. Problem is the cataloging process and the definition and the process of finding the rightful owners has been variable across the board. Not two museums or universities do it in the same way. There's a lot of controversy about that. I think we're going to hear about that tonight. What are tribal remedies when it comes to the Nagpra, if they don't feel that things are being done right? Well, if there is an item that was taken from tribal lands or federal lands after 1990, which is pretty recent, ritual sacred objects can be claimed by a tribe under Nagpra, and they can file a civil suit for replevin or recovery of that item to the tribal community that owned the project. It's not easy to prove ownership, community ownership, but they can go in that direction to claim superior title to individuals that hold that, so long as, again, they can show that it came from a federal source or tribal lands, and they have the actual ownership. Part of that cultural ownership is sometimes called cultural patrimony. And you're going to hear that term a few more times as well. And that is kind of the communal ownership of a cultural item. The problem is Nagpra does not deal with cultural objects in private collections. And that becomes a problem because there's a lot of those types of items that are out there in the world. Next statute that we will talk about is the Archaeological Resources Protection Act of 1979. And that was helpful. ARPA was based primarily on where was a project coming from. And once we know where it came from, if it was coming from a protective resources, it provided a little bit more firepower on how to protect that resource. It's already a crime under ARPA to buy or sell an object that was taken without a permit in contravention from Nagpra or from federal lands. And that actually dates back to the passage of the Antiquities Act back in 1906. Problem is between 1979 when ARPA was passed and 1906 when the Antiquities Act was passed, it wasn't really enforced that way. But it was acknowledged in ARPA that the Antiquities Act is still applicable, and it provided some teeth to the Antiquities Act. So now it allows for kind of a reach back into time, that if it was taken at a time all the way back to 1906, there's a way for prosecutions under ARPA to pull that item back to the community that's resolved. It's kind of an umbrella statute to allow for criminal or civil punishment for the wrongful taking of cultural artifacts. The problem is, if you have one article that you can show that came from federal lands and you can enforce that through ARPA, through the Antiquities Act, there may be an exactly identical item that came from an area that was not federal lands that ARPA really does not have the authority to recover. So that becomes a problem. We'll be talking a little bit more about that today. There's another statute that's been, it's not a statute yet, it's a bill that's been proposed. It was proposed originally, I believe, in 2015, 2017 again, and it's currently on the docket right now. It's called the Safeguard Tribal Objects of Patrimony Act. It's called the STOP Act. It was reintroduced in 2019, and it's currently in front of the Committee on Indian Affairs as of about 3 weeks ago. What this one is this is actually meant to be a bipartisan omnibus statute that will actually give teeth to all these projects, or all these statutes, and allow them to enforceably bring back some of these resources to the tribes and allow the tribes to actually have the power to be able to reach out and get these things. It'll make it a separate crime to export not only sacred or ritually significant articles, but any type of Native American artifact that, if that artifact is over 100 years old. So it doesn't have to come necessarily from federal land. And that's important. It has been amended the last couple of times when the STOP Act was in place, that the federal mandate was put in place. Recent provisions have shown that it wasn't, but we'll see how it ends up when it's a bill that's actually approved. The whole idea is to give the Native American community a voice and a capability to reach back in where they find some of their resources on an auction block and be able to pull them back to that community as their ownership. And only items that are legally obtained will get certification through this STOP Act to actually be sold. So anything that doesn't get certified through the STOP Act as something that was legally acquired and not culturally significant is subject to be pulled back by the STOP Act. So that's kind of a review of some of the laws we're going to be talking about. Oh, I stopped. Let me add one more, because this one's probably the most important one to Johnny. That's the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. I almost missed that, and that's absolutely important as well. This is kind of a truth in advertising law. It's supposed to prohibit misrepresentation of knockoff materials as actual, authentic American Indian art. Through this law, it's illegal to offer for display or sale any art or craft that falsely suggests that it's Indian produced, an Indian product, or the product of an Indian tribe or Indian arts and craft organization. It's designed to protect the consumer, but also more importantly, the creators and the tribes, and keep them safe from disingenuous business people. It is a criminal statute. For a first-time violation of the act, an individual can face civil or criminal penalties up to $250,000 fine and a 5-year prison term, or both. And if a business violates the act, they can be prosecuted up to $1 million. Earlier this year, 3 people were prosecuted out of the Philippines for making authentic Indian jewelry out of the Philippines. All 3 of them ultimately pled guilty and they were sentenced. I looked online to see if I could find what the sentence was. I understood it was going to be a heavy one, but maybe some of the other panelists had heard what it is, but they're all facing prison time and significant fines for the number of articles that they were selling disauthentically. Other examples of traditional items that you're going to see as protected under the Indian Arts and Crafts Act: baskets, pottery, paintings, woven rugs, kachina dolls, clothing. All of these things are often copied by individuals and claimed to be American Indian items. And all of these things, by making those claims, are injuring those people that actually do that work and are authentic American Indian artists. So with that, you've learned a little bit about some of the laws at play in the issue of the propriety and who owns American Indian art and cultural items, and how they wander from that ownership and how perhaps they can get back into that ownership. But let's talk about that difference. And I'm going to ask the first question to Johnny Contreras, if you don't mind. How would you describe the distinction for yourself about the distinction between cultural items and something that is art? You've been doing this for 35 years.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us what you think?
Well, Ted, that just listening to how you posed the descriptions on the laws and some of the other characteristics of what's taken place and not taken place as far as protecting cultural items and non-cultural items, it really got me reeling back to when I first began doing artwork and some of the first, I guess I'd say, sightings of things, I'm going to go way back. There's my hands, okay? See, we're going back. 95, 96, doing a powwow up in Los Angeles with my kids. They were dancing, doing their thing. They had their shirts. They were excited. My son won his first $5 at one of the dances. And at the same time, I was doing some wares on a small table, started talking to some of the local folks. And it just had never really occurred to me, the lack of recognition up in Los Angeles for our fellow Native folks. But when you go to a powwow and everybody's so excited just to kind of, talk to you about reservation life and the different things taking place, it just really drove home. So at that show or powwow, I met a gal, and I ended up getting some of my, she was city public art director up in Los Angeles. And I ended up getting one of my first public pieces. But at the same time, it really made me aware of the fact that there was so much disconnection with a lot of the artists that were at the powwow, not feeling legitimate, not being able to walk up and be considered a fine artist at the local gallery or even some of the local non-native shows. And after that powwow, several others, Long Beach, various areas around Los Angeles, we kind of started a little group and just chatting about, well, what do you do? Where do you sell? How do you go about marketing and what have you? And it was just really kind of sad. It really pulled at my my inner soul that most of the Native folks had to go to these powwows and kind of like sell their wares in the parking lot and try to get booths. And I used to let guys just kind of hang on the corner of my booth and sell their pieces, and a lot of times, this was back in 96, the conversation went back to, when I do go somewhere downtown Long Beach or the surrounding area, and I talk to them about selling some of my wares, they're not recognized as authentic. Well, where are you from? I'm from Los Angeles. Oh yeah, who do you belong to? I belong to this particular group. Well, what do you do? Well, that doesn't look Native. That doesn't look Indian as typically as the story would go. And I thought, wow, gosh, that's a bummer. That actually happened. About maybe 6 months after I got one of my first big public commissions, I was invited to go to Arizona and I was over at the Herd, and on the way back, there was another small museum up in Prescott area, and I can't remember the name, but a couple older gentlemen were in there, a couple cowboy, you know, good old boys, and went in, and I was talking to them, and I had happened to have a piece I had just done that was about I was messing around with our creation story here in San Diego. So it was ocean oriented, had dolphins, had the water and all this other stuff. I was excited because I was like, you know, I'd love to have something here different, teach them, show them a different perspective. I went in and they said, you know, literally just asked me, do you have something that's a little more Indian? And that's what I came up with the saying, which I said not too long ago. I don't do a whole lot of things that you would probably expect. I don't put drums in my artwork. I don't put dream weavers in my artwork. And no offense to anybody that does dream weavers, but at the time I was trying to make the point, you know, this is about creation story, you know, our process. And they said, well, you know, son, if you get something that's a little more Indian looking, you come on back. And we'd love to put some of your work up in our museum. And well, yeah, I haven't been back yet. So, you know, I know that's the long way around to what, you know, the question being, you know, how do you deal with and how do you view these particular, you know, the original native art, and, you know, what do we consider cultural and what do we consider art? You know, that divide is so fine for us. And it takes me back to the lack of understanding and consideration for many natives' critical path and their critical thought, their critical timeline, and where they look. I believe that a lot of people view things that native artists do without the consideration for their critical thought path. You know, where are these particular ideas stemming from? And it's that lack of recognition, understanding, consideration that leads to and lends to the lack of recognizing true cultural items and artistic items. Because the cultural items, let's say sacred items, you know, things that individuals consider, individual native groups like here in San Diego, the Kumeyaay would consider sacred, without the understanding from the outside individual groups that don't understand the complexities of our history, the complexity of our philosophies. You know, we're really asking them to make a leap in order to understand how these particular things are going to be connected or be descriptive of a critical path. You know, to kind of put it down in one straight line, it's that lack of understanding and consideration for the Native Americans' critical path and critical thought that is, I think, encumbering all of everything that you were describing. It's what's made it real and making it happen day in, day out.
Thanks very much, Johnny. It's that line is fine, and I think that people that are unfamiliar and don't have an opportunity to have regular conversations with modern indigenous people, you know, think of Indian as something that happened in the 19th century. You know, right. That's their image. That's the only thing. You know what? There's modern people that hold the same culture, that have the same ideals, and I appreciate that was part of the message that you were trying to get across. That's fantastic. So part of the issue on the distinction between art and culture is, why was it created? You know, was it created for a purpose, for sale, or was it created for a cultural purpose? And that is sometimes referred to, you know, art by intention and art by appropriation. Dr. Frank, you've done some work on this. You've looked into this issue quite a bit. Could you give us a little bit more about this distinction between cultural ownership, personal ownership, and art by intention?
Thanks, everybody, and thanks for having this conversation. And I'm particularly taken with the example that Johnny Bear has just given us, because it's illustrative of kind of the root of the problem, which is a premise that I think most people in this country just don't understand. But going back to the distinction, which is not mine, by the way, art by intention and art by appropriation, is what Johnny was describing as the artist's mindset, the mental thread, the activity. So art that's made in a culture that recognizes people as artists, as art makers for art, and that's made for a market, that's art by intention. And everything else essentially is art by appropriation. So it refers to objects that may have been created for a different purpose or to champion values that are primarily cultural or not artistic, but subsequently have been given the status of art and in that sense have been appropriated by a dominant culture through museums, art dealers, collectors, and become in that sense tradable artifacts that is made into a kind of property, cultural property. And if you think about the difference between what in Johnny's story between what was expected as from him as a native artist, a Kumeyaay artist, and what his artistic intentions were, that is essentially the mindset of the appropriatedness, right? Imposing another view of what is Indian art, which is defined in our culture at the moment as art by appropriation, right? And so it often makes inauthentic art by intention when it's native art, right? So that is the problem. And just one more thing here, what moves, when we're talking about art appropriation, what moves things into the market becoming property is this distinction, is this process of transit from where things are made, right? So if you make a cultural item for your own people and for a particular use, whether it has aesthetic parts of it or not, while it's consumed and used within that culture and society, it's what it's supposed to be, right? And when it moves outside of that, the transit allows it to make a transition, and it transitions in status from its original meaning and value through that transit to become a piece of cultural property that's then defined by the property laws, many of which are anchored in some of the laws about cultural materials that you gave us an introduction to before. So that movement from whatever the intention of the original creator was to the public view through appropriation is really what we're talking about. And if you think about it, it's everything that we're talking about, except for artists of native, communities that are making art by intention and is recognized as such. So I'll pause there, and I have some examples, but they move the conversation to a different place.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frank. And one of the important points is this idea of items that were owned by the community that created them is really important. And one of the reasons why I had mentioned a little bit earlier about how obscured the story of the people that came from millennia before the people that are here now is because things have been disturbed. And yes, that story of those people and their history, some of them are burial sites, some of the people are buried in locations, some places are just village sites that might have pottery or other things that can tell you part of the story or certainly part of their history. And all of those are pixels to be able to develop the story of those individuals. But whose pixels are those? Whose part of the picture are those? Well, those are actually belonging to the community that left them behind or the community that inherited them themselves. And taking away those pixels takes away a significant part of that picture, that misappropriation activity. And it's happened over the years, and many times it can be very damaging effects on the individuals that are buried in a location, perhaps with some very important items that they held close to them during their living time, and were left there so that a creator would be able to have those gifts when they're brought back. Someone coming in and grave robbing and taking those things and walking away from them, could be damaging that soul for eternity in many tribal religious eyes. It becomes a real problem. Now, is it just, a couple of things that I'm talking about? Does it just happen occasionally? Well, Dr. Don, if you can talk to us, is misappropriation really a problem? Does it happen often? Tell us more about how misappropriations happen locally and nationally.
Well, the short answer to that question is yes, misappropriation occurs and it is continuing to occur. And there's a lot of different angles from which you can approach this question. So, for my work, I'm sitting here right now in my office on the Paula Reservation in San Diego, which, as a brief aside, I want to say I always appreciate land acknowledgements. So I'm acknowledging that I am on Luiseno land. Not all of San Diego County is Kumeyaay. There's also Luiseno, Cupeño, and Cahuilla, along with our Kumeyaay brothers and sisters to the south. I'm not a tribal member myself, but it's been my privilege to be able to work for Paula for the past going on 16 years. And part of my work as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer is to provide protection to the cultural resources, the cultural sites, the sacred sites, all of these things that are important to the members of the Paula Band of Mission Indians, and also to neighboring communities, because there's a lot of overlap between these different communities in terms of stories and marriage ties, kinship and shared experience. And part of that shared experience is this experience of misappropriation. So we have many examples of individuals and institutions deciding that items that belong to tribal communities and families and individuals are things that should be taken away, either taken away to be displayed at a museum, or in most cases put into a box or a drawer and remaining on dusty shelves so that people can allegedly study them. Those things are taken all the time. And instances of individuals who decide that they want to have, a so-called artifact, an Indian object in their own personal collection. So they will take shovels and they will dig through the ground, or they will go hiking up into the mountains looking for caves and finding pottery that maybe was left with human remains, as part of that individual's journey to the ancestors. And they take these things because there's this sense that we're living in a time where Native America is in the past. And, like a lot of what Johnny said, his own work, there's this expectation that if you're going to identify yourself as a Native American artist, then your work is supposed to look something like what the media has portrayed as being Native American. So if you don't have feathers, teepees, horses, and headdresses, then somehow it's not appropriately Native American. And yet at the same time, people want to find these objects so that they can have, I think in some senses, a connection with the past, but they don't make the acknowledgement that there are living communities that these things still belong to. So let me show you some examples of where an individual took it upon himself to create this enormous collection of what he considered to be, tribal artifacts, and they are misappropriated as artworks, as if any individual has a right when they find something to take it and display it as something to share with others that was made for display. And so this is a room, one of many, many, many rooms of an individual named Don Miller in Indiana. In 2014, the FBI, working on some tips, raided Mr. Miller's house, where he had garages and warehouses and storage bins with hundreds of thousands of pieces from not just Native America, but throughout the world, including over 500 individual Native American ancestral remains, by which I mean skeletal remains. And what's interesting about this to me in this area where it becomes a misappropriation and it gets branded as art, the FBI decided to do this action when they heard about the skeletal remains, but they didn't do anything about the objects that were considered to be Indian art. So it wasn't the projectile points, it wasn't the pottery, it wasn't the katsinas, it wasn't the baskets. It was finally the human remains that got the federal government to step in and actually enforce the laws. So this is a case where even the federal government is saying, well, does this really fall under Nagpra? Is this something that really has protection? And the answer in this instance for the objects was no. Another example, these are Mission Indian baskets. Now, California's Mission Indians were renowned for the quality, the artistry, and the beauty of their baskets. Just amazing, the artwork. If you've ever seen one of these up close and personal, they are just tremendous examples of artistic talent and hard work. Well, this ended up becoming an instance where, for survival reasons, these women who were the weavers had to create these baskets and sell them for their own survival. So they create this movement of these really important objects out of tribal hands and into the hands of collectors, because there was no other way in many instances for people to survive. So what should have been kept in families was instead sold, for probably much less than their true value, to people passing through Paula, passing through San Pasqual, which San Pasqual, by the by, is the traditional lands are what we now call the Wild Animal Park. and so these objects move out. And these, in many cases, these were utilitarian, but they were also objects of beauty. And the idea that you have to be forced to sell something of such tremendous value and importance to you, your family, and your community, is just to survive, is a really heartbreaking example of how something goes from tribal hands and into the hands of the larger community. And then finally, so this is a little bit of a fuzzy picture, but this is a photograph from 2012 of a rock art panel north of Bishop, California. These are petroglyphs. Now, a petroglyph is a rock carving, an artwork. A pictograph is a painting. These were stolen. This is one that they weren't able to remove, but an individual or individuals brought masonry tools and saws and chisels to actually remove these pieces of rock art from this protected rock art site north of Bishop. This is a site that the Paiute people still visit, that they still consider sacred, where they still practice ceremony, and yet there's still profit to be made from removing these rock art panels and selling them. There are people who are willing to pay top dollar for this sort of theft. So these are the kinds of things that we're dealing with still on an ongoing basis, where essentially, let's just call it the white colonizer gaze has turned Indian objects into objects of art that are meant for the enjoyment of non-Indian people. So we deal with this all the time. I could go on, but.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gan. Important points and really graphic images of things that have been taken away from communities and then put on the open market and traded probably several times and gathered inappropriately. That's a tragedy, and it's something that we have to, and you and I have seen, because I've worked with Dr. Gan before, we've seen evidence of the same sort of activity here in San Diego County. It happens here, and it doesn't just happen in the Midwest or up in Bishop and that sort of thing. It's a real problem everywhere. Now, Dr. Frank, you've also done a significant amount of work with misappropriation of items, some of which are a little bit more historic, but it's a fascinating story about both how you looked into that misappropriation activity and then how you tried to do a little something about it. Could you share that story with us?
I would love to. I'm trying. There are two historic examples that connect to what Shasta was saying that I want to get in there at some point. But yeah, let me do this just really quickly because it's a way of answering your question. So I want to just provide a couple examples, and this is in addition to what Shasta was talking about. And I've obscured the image here, which was taken in 1879 by the first Bureau of American Ethnology photographer who went with the Stevenson expedition to the Southwest, and they were at Zuni, and they saw one of the shrines of the Ayuda, the war god, the Zuni war gods, and these are twin deities with great power. They're associated with prowess and physical skill. They serve as protectors of the Zuni people. And the priest of the bow, one of the societies, it was one of the, we would call them sacred societies, religious societies in Zuni, creates these cylindrical objects, sculptures, and they enshrine them in specific places around Zuni, and there are a number of these shrines, and they rotate from time to time throughout either one or more times each year. And the old shrine sculptures are set aside to basically go back to nature in their own time. And since this picture was taken in 1879, these ayuda have been collectible, and the first collection was in fact by the Stevenson collection that brought some of these back to the Bureau of American Ethnology, which is now part of the National Museum of American Anthropology. And the Zuni started to recover these pieces from the collections all over the world in 1978. So this is before Nagpra. There wasn't a law that it wasn't technically illegal in terms of American property law to buy and sell these. But the Zuni developed a procedure and a tribal policy that said that these are communally owned. Therefore, if any of them are outside of Zuni, they were removed illegally from the point of view of the tribe, and that they need to be returned to their proper place on the ongoing Zuni religion. And they went institution by institution and collector by collector and dealer by dealer and to art auction houses. And between 1978 and 1995, they collected 80 of these materials to go back to Zuni. No lawsuit. They had a legal theory, which in fact is part of what's now enshrined in Nagpra. They didn't use Nagpra. But what I want to draw the attention here is that within the world of appropriation, the kind of native understanding of why these things are created and what they're in the world to do and how they're supposed to exit the world is something that contravenes that right of appropriation in a particular way if it's properly taken out there. So this is a kind of another kind of border that we're talking about, the border between the appropriation and the indigenous understanding that can work against that appropriation. I want to really quickly contrast it with another item. This was a bow and quiver, and particularly a shield that White Bear, who Americans call Satanta, one of the important leaders in the Kiowa people, Kiowa community, Setant in Kiowa. And this shield was made by another Kiowa religious leader named Black Horse in the 1790s, and it was given in ceremony in the proper way through Kiowa ceremony to Setant as a youth. His son inherited it, and he served as a scout in Troop L in the Army under his commander, Hugh Scott. And when he died in 1894, he left it to his commander, Hugh Scott, who then sold the shield to an agent who was collecting Indian materials for the Hebe Apperson Hearst, the Hearst maven, who had just founded the museum, the art museum at UC Berkeley. So this shield ended up at Berkeley. In 1991, Satant's descendants asked for the shield to be returned to the Kiowa under Nagpra. Now, they said it was sacred. They said they didn't claim it as an object of patrimony because it wasn't required by an ongoing religious practice, which is the way the wording of Nagpra reads. It was not taken from the tribe illegally because it wasn't owned communally in Satanta's time. He had the individual rights to that, to the power in that shield and the shield itself. But nonetheless, they said that this was important to the tribe, to the Kiowa people, and it should come back. This went through the Nagpra Review Committee at least three times, and they decided that Nagpra couldn't apply as a matter of law. But in this discussion, and they asked for the museum and the Kiowa folks to come to an agreement. And finally, in 2001, the Phoebe Hearst Museum agreed to a permanent loan of the Satant shield to Fort Sill Museum in Lawton, Oklahoma, where it still is. Now, I give you those examples because they show that the issue of what the appropriation of Native material objects into and cultural patrimony into the marketplace, into the world that's set value by non-native standards does and how large that reach is. And that gives me an entry to what Ted asked me to talk about. So I have now for almost 30 years been collecting, well, digitizing, let's say, the objects of drawings that were done on paper by Plains Indian artists from the 1860s to the 1890s. And they were done originally on accountant's ledger books. And this is the website where I put these up for public view as a preservation idea, because the more you can do digitally, the less you have to handle the actual materials, which are fragile in and of themselves, and as a research tool. But I wanted to show you a couple of these things. So here, for example, is the Abbott Ledger that the Stern Museum of the Prairie Pioneer in Grand Island, Nebraska is the conservator of. And you see the original ledger book. And this was drawn on by Northern Cheyenne warriors in the 1860s and early 1870s. And it was actually taken in some way that we don't know how from the person who had used it as their accountant's ledger book and letter book. They were actually writing letters and conversation in there. And at some point in 1869, it left non-Indian hands and became part of the Cheyenne, and they drew things like this. And this is really what's of interest, because these are records of the deeds of important warriors, in this case, the Cheyenne culture in the 1860s and subsequent, because this was now after 1869 in the hands of Cheyenne. And even though these are actual events that happened, so these are counting coup against a cavalry soldier who is firing his pistol, his gun at this Cheyenne warrior. It says a lot about the traditional culture, clothing, warrior material. But and here's the name glyph of the actual warrior. This is, we can identify who the actual warrior might have been from the glyph. It shows where the horses came. So it's an actual event. But what it's really showing is the kind of spiritual power that the warrior had in order to enact this exploit on the native person. Now, these books have become part of the appropriated native material. And as the example of the Akuma Shield, often they were collected by museums, and the early ones often came through military hands, just like Akuma Shield. So this item came into the hands of the museum through a gift. This one is a ledger book that is part of the incarceration at Fort Marion after the Red River War. Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Comanche warriors were rounded up and basically summarily sent to prison without even a trial for quote unquote depredations. And these sketchbooks were done while incarcerated at Fort Marion. So they were done for money in some of the same kinds of ways in which Shasta talked about the creation and selling of mission baskets. This was done for money. They're essentially art by intention, yet they're done in a position of where, you know, these are subjects and subjected to incarceration. So the power dynamics are extraordinarily skewed. Yet these were both sold to tourists that came to San Augustine to see the Fort Marion prisoners, and were given by the commander of the prison, Captain Pratt, to important personages that visited in order to curry political favor. And Captain Pratt went on to essentially found the first Indian boarding school at Carlisle, which became the model for all Indian boarding schools. So this was in private hands for generations, because it was given by Pratt to a volunteer white school teacher who had taught Kobe, the Kiowa artist, and other artists who were part of the prisoners. And it remained in that family until it was sold on the market and eventually actually donated to UC San Diego, where it is in the collection there. Here's another one. This is a Northern Cheyenne book called the Ewers Ledger, after the captain of the 5th Infantry in the Army. And it was a scout's book. His Cheyenne scouts drew these images, and it entered again through a family after 4 generations into the art market, and is now owned by an art dealer or a private collection or something like that. So I'm just describing the way in which these things come into the market, and in fact, these are all extraordinarily recent. Like almost everything I've shown you, except for the first one, is from the 2000s, basically. And this one is from the, yeah, I have the wrong photo, but the other example I was going to give you was one that was actually given to a young man who was ransomed back to white society from Cheyenne society with this ledger book in hand that he had been given by the Bowstring Society chief, which he was part of that family before he was returned back to his white family. So these have all sorts of different and often what we would in legal terms say voluntary transitions into the market. But the market does weird things, right? So this is a ledger book that just sold last year for almost $400,000, and it has 33 images in it. And just last month, one Howling Wolf Fort Marion ledger drawing sold for $106,000. So that's an incredible market incentive to tear these books apart, which is why the project that I put together to try to digitize and make them publicly available becomes, increasingly important. And it's really supposed to be a way of signaling to the world that this stuff needs to be preserved. So we're talking about proprietary interests that Native people have in Indian produced material that is in contravention to the way the art market works. And let me just point out that everything I've shown you is in non-Native hands. I don't know of one ledger book from the period of the 1860s to the 1890s when these were first created by Indian practitioners that's in a tribal hand. And there probably are some, but I don't know of any. And I've been doing this for almost 30 years. So what I'm suggesting is that there's a prior proprietary interest in Native art that is not seen by most people because of the way that art by appropriation operates. And it's something that we need to have some consideration for, in addition to the material that's misappropriated, the way the material that Shasta showed and the Zuni war gods that I began with were.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. That's
Excellent.
really important points. And one of the issues you brought up that is art by intention, necessarily art by intention if it's being done under duress. Shasta, you brought that up as well. Take away the ability of somebody to survive to the point where they're actually forced to be able to produce items just merely to survive from day to day. Is that really art created by intention, or is that just trying to survive? And maybe we should take a stronger look at that, because those types of issues might be the pathway to be able to get some of these things back into the hands of the people that they really belong to. We've talked about, we've used the term a couple of times, cultural genocide in the misappropriation activity. And Shasta, I was wondering if you could kind of key off of that term and tell me what does that mean? What does that mean to the people, and why is that term used in misappropriation situations?
So genocide, of course, is a very strong term that I think most people understand as being the literal physical extinction of a group of people. When you get it from the root of it, it's genetics or genesis, origins. And side means kill. So it's essentially killing a people. Now, when you append culture to that, then it's something that's also known as ethnocide, where the people themselves may still exist, but their culture has been eliminated. So cultural genocide is exactly that. You can destroy a people's practices without eliminating the people themselves. And in the sense of what we're talking about here, the misappropriation of these items and the fact that so many of them have still yet to be returned to their proper owners and their proper communities, that is in a form of cultural genocide, or it's, to me, it indicates that there's still this attitude within the larger society that Native American people no longer exist, or that the tribes that do exist, because they no longer fit to the mold of what we as Westerners have been taught to expect of Native American people, that they no longer have a right to their own items of cultural patrimony. And of course, that's completely wrong. And in my research in the past, I've looked at the impacts of Indian gaming on tribal culture, and that's something that comes up often, which is that you aren't authentic if you have gaming. How can you really say? I know Johnny's like, yeah, tell me about it. And of course, Paula has a casino and San Pasqual has a casino. Please visit them both; they are open and safe. But there's this idea that Native American people are supposed to be frozen in time. So if nobody still lives in the way that people were living when these objects were created, then there's nobody who can put a claim on them. And then also from a perspective of the way Western science views these objects, there's a really big difference between the way that tribal people see these things as being part of their culture and history, and the way, say, anthropologists, and full disclosure, I am also an anthropologist, but trying to make a better name for my discipline. Anthropologists and archaeologists and scientists, they believe that they have some right to hold on to these things. And I think that also crosses over into the continuing cultural erasure through the appropriation of objects by renaming them as art as opposed to cultural patrimony. And I mean, I could talk about this forever, but an important thing I do want to note about some of these laws. So Nagpra, for example, Nagpra was not written by tribal people. Nagpra was written by Washington, and I think that the intentions were good, but when that legislation was originally written, I forget the exact amount of time, but they said something like, within 10 years, all ancestral remains should be returned to their communities. It's 30 years later, and UC Berkeley alone has hundreds of thousands of individuals, and not full skeletons necessarily. There's parts and pieces, which is awful to think about. But 30 years later, they're no closer to being done than they were when the legislation was written. But the key point about that from an art and artifact perspective is that tribal people weren't the ones who got to define what constitutes an item of cultural patrimony. And if you are really going to do this right and stop the erasure of culture, then you need to take a page out of the book of one of our local institutions, the San Diego Museum of Man, which has a new policy that they're calling decolonization of the museum, where they are identifying the appropriate communities to which objects should be returned. And if that tribe says, we want those objects back, they are giving them back. No Nagpra, no questions asked. And if that means that their collection is empty, then so be it. They understand that that's the way it should be. I would hope that a lot of other museums throughout the world would do the same thing and recognize that if they want to have access to those objects, then they need to start from the beginning, and they need to go to Johnny. They need to go to the tribal chairs. They need to go to Native people throughout the country and throughout the world and say, do we have your permission? And if the permission isn't forthcoming, then that's the end of the story, because there's no right, no human right that says Westerners get to study something because they have decided that it's important. Where these objects came from, whether it's ledger art or whether it's a skeletal remain, these are things that belong back with those communities so that we can begin the process of healing those scars from this ongoing cultural genocide.
Well, really well said. And again, that
Well
goes
said.
to who owns it. Who does own these items? Who do they belong to? And a lot of it goes to public perception. Today's community, it's appalling sometimes when you see, precisely what's going on. And I applaud Museum of Man for the activities they've done over the last few years in doing the repatriation activities voluntarily. And I think that the local community is very, very happy with it. It's not always that way. I mean, I was actually unlucky enough to be at a public meeting once when I had a tribal client that was proposing a project before a public body, and it was a gaming project, and one of the elected officials on the dais stopped a conversation part way and said, "Why is it that they feel they have to do this? Why can't they just sell beads and baskets on the side of the road?"
Oh my
Now,
God.
this was a person in a position of power, an elected official that was so out of sorts with how they sounded that they thought that was the right thing to say. So we're up against it. It's going to be really hard to change the conversation and enlighten people about some of these things. But Johnny, I'm going to jump to you next. I hope that you can help us in part of that transition. We haven't had a chance to go enough into, what today's modern, what the modern native art market is, and how does it reflect indigenous cultures? I'd like you to go into a little bit about that, because all these other issues are difficult issues, but I think the issue of the translation of today's modern art to modern individuals is equally difficult.
Absolutely. I'll go off some of Shasta's statement in referencing Mom, Museum of Man. I like to say Mom. They've been doing a good job, maybe even great in regards to returning some of the items in question. I'm sorry, but I've heard that as you were talking, Shasta, and you mentioned my name, I thought about that hair commercial where the guy says, not only do I use it, I'm also a member of the hair thing, right? Well, not only am I a Native American, a contemporary Native American sculptor, but I also sit on KCRC, Kumeyaay Cultural Repatriation Committee. So I've been at a lot of the meetings of Museum of Man, and where we're going through collections and talking about findings that nobody knew they were there, really. They weren't sure what they were connected to, and sifting through how these things were put together. And often we'll ask, well, can we kind of bring everything together and approach this process cohesively? And they really try to accommodate, but sometimes those federal laws do get in the way. And sometimes, I hate to, as they say, speak out of class, but sometimes we have to go out at other places that we talk about, well, how can we best get to a result and resolve some of the issues there to help things be expedited, making sure that anything that is associated with burial goods gets back in a good way, in the proper way. So that was my whole thing about being part of the hair club. So but I'm also a contemporary artist, and some of my slides are running now. This piece was for the city of Poway, and similar to what you were talking about, Ted, I was in one of the meetings many years ago, and one of the elected officials who was just tired of me asking questions as to what I was a site monitor for our reservation, and I wasn't happy with what their process was going to be for returning some of the artifacts when Poway was going through some of its first development stages. And so I asked the questions, can we do this? Can we do that? And he stood up out of his chair, looked at me and said, we're trying to accommodate you the best we can, but you keep going around in a circle. And I said, yeah. I said, I kind of a lot like when we ask you what you found and how are you going to handle it, And many years later, I ended up doing some of the work, which is shown here in front of City Hall. And it was really interesting because I had been called by several city officials and I hadn't returned their call. I really thought it was about some prior discussions we had on archaeology. And I was just kind of in the middle of my art world, and I had kind of stepped away from archaeology. And it turned out they wanted me to consider doing some work for the city, which was great. This piece is at US Grant. This is called Shadow of the Sun. When I was at the Grant, that particular piece, Shadow of the Sun, was several of the pieces that you're seeing they really come from a visit that I had to Rome. I went to Rome, took my family to Rome. We're up on Palatine Hill, and we're listening to the creation story of Romulus. I come back, and the first question I had was, where's our statuary that speaks to our path, our creation story, the Kumeyaay people, here in San Diego, among with our other, our Luiseño brothers and sisters, where's the statuary that speaks to their creation story? Where are these particular things? Why aren't people flying from across the world to see where these installations are, where these first original things were, first founded and created? Well, when I got back from Rome, I was doing some pieces for Chairman Tucker at the U.S. Grant, and this particular piece is the second piece. The first piece was People of the Sun, which is a popular song done by a group I still enjoy, Rage Against the Machine. This second piece is I was trying to demonstrate the native spirit still existing and returning through the rays of the sun every day. But those rays and that individual are still tied to the earth, is still moving. We're still here. We're still going through the process. We're still defining what our creation is. And so as a contemporary artist, those were some of the first questions. And I'll admit, when I got back from, Rome, I was really wanting to do some contemporary pieces, some abstract, really get it out there. But there's a real void for artwork that just speaks to some of the most basic premises that connect our people to the land and connect the people that are on the land now through us to the land. And I still feel that it's part of my mission to create these pieces that pose those questions, that help people to look at and say, well, what the heck are you talking about, right? What do you mean shadow of the sun? We are the people in the shadow of our creator and the sun going through the process every day. We're all that. These were the singers. They were in front of Valley View for a while. They're going to actually be back at Palomar College. So being a contemporary artist, Ted, and identifying, working through and creating, taking the most basic premises and just kind of expanding on them. I kind of thought I would go through a phase, maybe 10, 15 years, kind of exercise a lot of those things out, but I haven't. I think I'm barely even starting to, scratch the surface. We need a lot more native artists. We need a lot more, fine artists, and where we're representing our critical path, our critical thought. Lately, I've been fortunate enough to do a couple pieces, University of UCSD, USD, and I've been given some artistic freedom. But I had a conversation with Ted the other day, in where I always feel like I have to walk on both sides of the road. I have to first qualify and identify myself as this cultural person. By the way, I'm an enrolled member of the San Pasqual Band of Mission Indians. That's our moniker, number 245, and so on and so forth. And here's my paperwork with my enrollment number and my authenticity. It's real. Now, can I be considered to do some, native artwork? And not, that didn't actually take place, but that's what you feel. And afterwards, it's like, oh, and you're also a fine artist. Yes, I'm also a member, and I'm a user. I'm also a fine artist. And here's some of the products that I've done. I'm a nationally recognized artist, but it's that catch-22. I talk to other native artists, and they're like, man, where do I get started? What do I do? I let the cat out of the bag. You do just like I did at the beginning. You tell them you're already a professional, you're already recognized nationwide, and by the time they find out, the check's already been cashed, and you're going to do the work. That's how I got my first public artwork. I never would have been able to go through that because we don't have any prestigious art schools here for Native Americans. We have art schools, but Native American art, we have American Indian Studies now, in many of the institutions. And there's Stan kind of, and there he is. There's Dr. Rodriguez, right? Doing the dedication at UCSD. And therein lies that process. We have a foot in both worlds. And even here on San Pasqual, I often tell some of my family members, they'll ask me to, Chancellor, they'll ask me to participate, get back into some of the political committees here on San Pasqual. And as of late, I've really been driving home the fact that there's a new frontier for me, you know, as a Native American artist, and the lack of artists, you know, I really need to be out there. I need to be out there helping to, you know, break down some of the, you know, misinterpretations and create those connections and be on more panels like this, you know, and get out to some of the different groups that are advocating for awareness, which there's a real strong, you know, there's a movement now and there's an understanding. And at 57 years old, I'm old enough to remember in the 70s when a lot of things were really, I wouldn't say coming to an end, but there was still this awareness. You know, I'm the youngest of 10. There was an awareness with my older brothers and sisters, you know, American Indian movement, you know, the Chicano movement, Chicano power, you know, Black Panthers, all these different groups, you know, they existed. And so here we are again, you know, and what is it that I'm able to participate in? Well, you know, I'm a fine artist and I make a pretty penny at what I do. But I'm willing to do most of this work to get recognition for our people and the cause as it is. I do things for whatever, for cost. Shh, don't tell anybody that.
Thanks very much, Johnny Bear. Really appreciate that insight. You know, we've covered a lot of areas. We actually are, believe it or not, our outline actually went longer than this, but we're getting kind of towards the end of the time that we have available. Boy, it went by really fast. And we could go on for a long time on some of these issues. And one of the other things I was going to talk about is some of the fraudulence that have occurred with the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. And to me, that is a crime to individuals today. The cultural misappropriation is a crime to the people that were here before us as well as to the people today. But I guess I'd like to close and feel free to go on a little bit for each one of you. I'd just like to ask each one of you kind of, what do you see as the biggest challenge to the protection of Indians' art and culture in today? I mean, we've talked about several things. There's, you know, part of it is being able to build a legacy. Part of it is building an understanding. You know, part of it is stopping the misappropriation. But I'd like each one of you to go into your ideas of, you know, what do you think is most important? I'm going to start with you, Shasta.
Okay, I like going first because that means that the other two can't steal what I might want to say.
I can agree.
Well, first of all, I'm sitting over here laughing every time, Johnny, you mentioned being, you know, the hair club for men. I'm not only
that's it.
I'm not only the owner, I'm also a client, you know, which and I didn't know you did jewelry, so we're gonna have to talk because, you know, take a look here.
Oh my, yes,
yeah,
yes.
Definitely. If you want to make sure, just to our audience, if you want to make sure that you're getting authentic Native art, buy it from the artist.
Absolutely.
You know, so do not get your turquoise off of eBay or Amazon or what have you. You need to go to those places where you can meet the artist or the member of their family who's helping to support them, and make sure that you're getting the real deal. But as far as challenges, other than saving my money and not being poor because I bought all this turquoise, the challenges are real. The challenges for, you know, protecting these things, I think, in a large part have to do with a wholesale cultural shift in the way that we see other communities. And so, you know, in this moment, we are seeing a resurgence of what is not a new problem in the United States, which is inequity amongst communities of color, or what we're calling BIPOC, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so it's interesting to me that a lot of non-people of color, white people, to put it simply, don't sometimes think, oh my gosh, now this problem is it's coming up again. And to me, that's a problem. It's not coming up again. It's here still. And so to me, that's the challenge, is that we have to change this mindset that the way the white gaze, the colonial gaze, has constructed the world needs to change, so that we stop thinking that a particular way of power defining what constitutes art, what constitutes culture, what constitutes rights and responsibility comes from just this one place, a system of power that's been in place in this continent for over 400 years. It's going to take a lot to change that. So given that we have all the weight of that history over us, I see that as one of the biggest challenges that there is. And it really, really relates to this difficulty that tribes have in getting their things back. Getting back those things that go up for auction, like Ross talked about, these beautiful, amazing pieces of ledger art that if you could find the descendants of those artists, they should have those things back. How do you do that when the auction house says, yeah, but we have a contract with the owner? What is the owner? The owner is the creator, as far as I'm concerned, if it wasn't sold with the intention of selling it as an artwork and instead of being under duress because of survival or whatever the case may be. So how are we going to change that attitude? I don't know. I think that panels like this are a start. I would hope that the STOP Act that you brought up, Ted, is something that does get passed and that helps. But we got to start over with stuff like Nagpra, and instead of having it be, oh, find who it belongs to, let's make sure that we can scientifically document that this object or item or ancestral skeleton actually belongs to that community, and just let the tribes decide. I'm on the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation because I'm the chairman of the board for the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. So I get the right to sit on that council. And I've been to meetings in Washington, D.C. where the council sits around and says, how do we know what an object of cultural patrimony is? And I say, it's whatever the tribes say it is. How do we know that something is a sacred landscape? Do we have to write a position paper on this? And I say, no. It's what the tribes say it is. What is traditional ecological knowledge? I'm like, all right, for the third time, it's what the tribes say, which means that there are 567, maybe more now, individual answers, because that's how many federally recognized tribes there are. And that means that there are hundreds more individual answers because those are the tribes that have lost recognition or never had recognition from the federal government, the thing that allegedly makes them real. So for every tribal person you talk to, you're going to have a different answer. But you know what? Stop trying to be the ones who define all these things on behalf of the tribes and just listen to the tribes. And I can write you a one-page position paper on what constitutes an item of cultural patrimony. It is what the tribes say it is. Period. Love, Shasta.
Thanks, Shasta. That was very helpful. And I love the love Shasta part of that. That was good. Dr. Frank, same question.
And a similar answer, actually. So I just want to point out that the solution, the problem here is the way that everything written in law is based on a conception of property rights that doesn't take into consideration any of the things that we've been talking about, including that idea of duress. Because under property law, that is not recognized as something that invalidates the exchange if it was done in a quote unquote voluntary way, right? And so I gave you examples of items, in fact, that were transferred to non-Indian hands in the proper ceremonial way at the time, which still, like the Satan Shield, which still that piece of material patrimony, cultural patrimony, still the Kiowa should have a claim to because of what it might mean to their society, which is the idea of trying to do something about the effects of cultural genocide. So these are larger aspects than what the law allows. And we were talking about the STOP Act, and that is in essence one of the problems with the STOP Act as well. And just very quickly, one of the reasons why the STOP Act is actually an issue is the auctions in Paris, in particular, of Hopi sacred Katsinam that took place in the early part of this decade or last decade. And then when the Hopi and other folks, including representatives from the government, tried to stop the sales, they were told, Well, the United States doesn't even have a laws that makes this illegal. How do you expect us to stop it? And finally, this Akuma Shield, which was pulled from the auction because the Akuma said that it was illegally taken from the reservation itself, brought up the issue of the Stop Act. The original act actually had a procedure that was more like what Shasta had presented, which is that all items, even in private hands, could be subject to a clawback if they were items of cultural patrimony, and that the tribes themselves, and there's a complicated process that tried to follow Nagpra, would actually decide how to do that. The current version, however, just tries to make a law that makes exporting material that should not be in private or public hands not exportable, and using that mechanism, those items might be subject to repatriation. But that still has the problem of the property right. And so to just conclude my remarks, this is a piece of contemporary ledger art by Linda Haukus, who's Lakota, called At the Museum. And what she's showing is the Lakota warrior societies seeing a member of their own community's art that they have to go view at the Denver Art Museum, right? Because they have no other access to it. And this is precisely what people who oppose things like the Stop Act are worried about. They're worried about Native people declaring everything something that should go back to those communities. So we're essentially saying, yes, that's the way it actually ought to be. And here's another contemporary ledger piece, also Lakota, by Wayne Wilcox, which is entitled All the Stories Yet to Tell. And you see all the different generations with their ledger books of the way of telling their own stories. And I show both of these things just to say, you know, what the kind of education that non-Indians in particular need to think about is a different way of understanding property, particularly as it connects to cultural patrimony, to objects that were made by other people. And I hate to do this to us at the end of a very productive hour and a half, but you know, in the Harry Potter series of books and movies, at the end, in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, there's a definition of the goblin concept of material culture ownership. And she says, to a goblin, the rightful and true master of any object is the maker, not the purchaser. They think that objects ought to have been returned to goblins once the original purchaser died. They consider our habit of keeping goblin-made objects, passing them from wizard to wizard without further payment, little more than theft. It seems to me that non-Indians ought to get used to that as the concept that goes along with material that's incredibly important to the communities that originally made them. And if that depresses the market for that kind of material, that's actually for the good, because that's the way of undermining the sort of property investment, which is a possessive investment essentially in being white and having that kind of privilege.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. Same question to you, Johnny Bear, and I'm afraid I'm looking at us and I don't want to run out of time, but we're fast approaching, and I notice that we do have some questions. So I hate to make you be a little bit brief on this, but I would like to know, what do you think are the biggest challenges right now on this issue?
The next generations and their identity. You know, we go through a lot of what's probably not well known as enrollment questions and issues, you know, throughout. So it's their identity. For me, it goes back to our creation story. You know, we're in a very much strong Christian-oriented creation story place, and when I talk to the next generation, I remind them, you know, that we're Kumeyaay, we have our own creation story. And as a public artist, you know, I plan on doing more pieces that, you know, help them to maybe find those roots and that identity. I really think, as you did in the opening, it starts in the dirt, starts in that connectivity, and that's really where I think the challenge lies, is that having them believe in that, you know, they are connected here, and all things, you know, they need to identify those things that are going to connect them and bring them back. And in doing so, I think they'll find that return or identity, and they'll find in that connectivity, they're going to find their identity.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for your presentations today. This has been really, really helpful. I hope that the the audience has learned as much as I have, and you've really honored all of us with your presence in how you can go forward.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I know that we're out of time. I think that it's been a very educating experience for me, just sitting and listening. I want to thank all of you for your time, for your expertise, and for your energy. As Mr. Griswold mentioned, I know that we spoke last year to try to get you all here and get this panel as part of our symposium. So I'm very happy and glad the way it turned out, because I think that you all provided so much perspective from various different positionalities. And I also echo what your sentiments are around folks that are in attendance. I think that, like you all said, I really feel like this could be its own, each of you could give a panel on the little bit that you shared today. So I'm deeply humbled and thankful for all of you sharing your expertise and knowledge. If we could give you a virtual round of applause, definitely, we'd give you a standing ovation. So I just wanted to echo on behalf of California Lawyers for the Arts, we're very grateful and thankful for the knowledge that you shared. So we're going to close with some words from our Executive Director, Alma Robinson, and thank you to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining our second annual symposium, Intersections, Art and Law at the Border. My name is Alma Robinson, and I'm the Executive Director of California Lawyers for the Arts. The COVID-19 pandemic provided us with an opportunity to reframe this symposium as a series of virtual programs. These will all be posted on our YouTube channel, along with other useful art law webinars. Many thanks to the San Diego Commission for Arts and Culture, the California Arts Council, the law firm of Perkins Coie, and other members of California Lawyers for the Arts for making this program possible. Thanks also to our San Diego Steering Committee, to the speakers for their excellent presentations, and our staff in Southern California for the many hours they dedicated to producing this series. If you have specific legal questions, please contact our lawyer referral service for assistance. We also offer a range of alternative dispute resolution services and an ongoing schedule of educational programs on various legal and business topics. I hope that you've enjoyed tonight's program and encourage you to browse our website for future programs and other information, including a list of COVID-related relief resources. Please consider joining CLA in order to help support our work as we advocate for the arts as an essential sector of our society. Thank you for your participation.